Child Protection in Emergencies. Part 1. Child Protection in Emergencies definition. Measures and structures to prevent and respond to abuse, neglect, exploitation and violence affecting children. The goal of child protection is to promote, protect, and fulfill children's rights to protection from abuse, neglect, exploitation and violence as expressed in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and in other human rights, humanitarian and refugee treaties and conventions, as well as national laws. Child Protection in Emergencies priorities. Family separation. Children are at risk of being separated from their primary caregivers during emergencies, either as a direct result of the emergency or as a result of its consequences. The identification of separated children, as well as tracing of their families and subsequent reunification, are therefore priorities in every phase of any emergency. Interventions that prevent secondary separation are also required. Recruitment into armed forces or armed groups. In situations of armed conflict, boys and girls are regularly recruited into armed forces or armed groups. While this involvement may be forced or voluntary, they take on a range of roles, including fighting, acting as spies or messengers, cooks and porters, and for sexual purposes. Recruitment exposes children to a number of extreme risks, such as death, physical injury, psychological damage, and sexual abuse. Return to civilian life can pose many challenges for both children and communities. Exploitation and gender-based violence, sexual violence and exploitation are chronic risks to girls and boys in situations of emergency. In times of social crisis, when their support and protective structures are limited or non-functional, children, particularly those who are displaced, are most vulnerable to abuses such as rape, incest, molestation, trafficking and early marriage. Physical harm. In every emergency, boys and girls risk being physically harmed. As the nature of armed conflict and natural disasters evolves, civilians are increasingly becoming targets and victims of violence and are at risk of being maimed or killed. The tremendous stress under which caregivers' life can lead to disproportionate punishments. Programs that enhance children's physical safety, such as landmine awareness, and that advocate for greater protection of girls and boys are essential in all emergencies. Psychosocial distress. During emergencies, children are exposed to a variety of extreme circumstances, some of which are beyond their capacity to cope. It is now accepted that in addition to meeting basic needs, such as food and shelter, it is essential to consider the emotional and developmental support of children. They recover from distressing experiences more quickly when supported by their family and community in a child-friendly environment. Child Protection Minimum Standards in Humanitarian Action. The Child Protection Minimum Standards, CPMS, have been developed to support child protection work in humanitarian settings by establishing common principles between those working in child protection, strengthening coordination between humanitarian actors, improving the quality of child protection programming and its impact on children, improving the accountability of child protection programming, defining the professional field of child protection in humanitarian action, providing a synthesis of good practice and learning to date, and strengthening advocacy and communication on child protection risks, needs, and responses. Who should use these standards? CPMS are intended for all humanitarian actors, particularly those who work in child protection or directly with children, families, and communities. This includes non-governmental organizations and international organizations, government personnel and policy makers, donors, coordinators and community groups, human resources staff, those working on advocacy, media, or communications. They may also be applicable to those working in the justice system, to border and immigration authorities and to security personnel. How do these standards connect with other humanitarian standards? The CPMS are technical standards on child protection in humanitarian action that connect with other humanitarian standards as part of a standards framework. The 10 principles in the CPMS include 4 Spheres Protection Principles, 4 principles from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, 2 that are specific to the CPMS. Principle 1, Survival and Development. Principle 2, Non-discrimination and Inclusion. Principle 3, Children's Participation. Principle 4, The Best Interests of the Child. Principle 5, Enhance people's safety, dignity, and rights and avoid exposing them to further harm. Principle 6, Ensure people's access to impartial assistance according to need and without discrimination. Principle 7, Assist people to recover from the physical and psychological effects of threatened or actual violence, coercion, or deliberate deprivation. Principle 8, Help people to claim their rights, sphere. Principle 9, Strengthen child protection systems. Principle 10, Strengthen children's resilience in humanitarian action. The Child Protection Minimum Standards comprises 4 main pillars. Pillar 1, Standards to ensure a quality child protection response. Pillar 2, Standards on child protection risks. Pillar 3, Standards to develop adequate strategies. Pillar 4, Standards to work across sectors.